Welcome back to my studio. Have you ever found yourself staring at a blank canvas, unsure of where to start because you're so afraid of making a mistake? Or maybe you finished a painting, but all you can see are the things that you did wrong. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. These fears hold back so many artists from reaching their full potential. But today, we're going to change that. Just one person at a time, just by your mindset. So in this video, I'm going to be sharing some mindset shifts that are going to help you to paint more confidently and fearlessly so you can stop worrying about making bad paintings and start embracing the joy of art making. Let's dive in. The first mindset shift that I want to share with you today is to stop seeing mistakes as failures and instead start recognizing them as moments where you're learning. Here's the deal. Even the most experienced artists mess up. We ruin paintings. Your favorite painter has paintings that have gone straight into the trash recently. I guarantee it, because it's part of the process. So instead of getting discouraged, or even worse, instead of reading into it as a reflection of your potential, ask yourself, what can I learn from this? Whether it's about the process you used and how to avoid making a muddy mess, whether it's about how you would have chosen a different reference that would have set you up for more success, how maybe some of the issues you were having with drawing should be tackled in graphite before you worry about trying to tackle them on canvas with paint in a loose painterly way in full color. When you stop fearing mistakes, you actually free yourself up to experiment, and that is where the real growth happens. So I think it's important to remember, you learning and growing, it's not about having this linear progress where every painting you make is better than the last. That it does not work that way for anyone, and it certainly didn't work that way for myself. Instead, I think it's really helpful to realize that we only learn when we mess up. The truth is that if you only ever play it safe, you're not actually really pushing your boundaries. You're just getting better at doing what you already do. And if you're watching this video, chances are you do want to change something about how you're working. You might follow this channel because you want to loosen up and get more painterly. You might want to have a higher degree of realism in your portraits without the piece looking like a photograph. So whenever there is something that you fundamentally want to shift in your work, it's important that you actually plan to make paintings that fail. And instead of thinking about those failures as, well, just that, failures, think about those paintings that aren't going to be ones you put in a frame or put up on social media. Think of those as the golden nuggets. The times where you actually know that you're pushing the boundaries and genuinely shifting the way that you work and learning something meaningful that you probably needed all along. Next, I want to talk about one of the biggest challenges painters face: perfectionism. So here is the truth. I know it's really tempting to think that perfectionism just means that you have really high standards. And I can't tell you how many artists I talk to who have watched a ton of my YouTube videos, but still come to me with a lot of frustration about their work, but very proudly wearing their perfectionism as a badge of honor. But here is the truth. Perfectionism, it chokes the life out of your creativity. If you are constantly worried about being perfect, one, you're never truly going to be satisfied. But even worse, you're going to really avoid taking the risks that lead to the real breakthroughs. As Brené Brown says, perfectionism isn't striving to be our best or working toward excellence. Healthy striving is internally driven. Perfectionism is externally driven by a simple but all-consuming question: what will people think? So what she's really driving at here is that when we call ourselves perfectionists, we're not pointing to an internal standard. We are pointing to a crippling fear of how others are going to judge what we make. And this is why letting go of perfectionism is so important. And don't get me wrong, having standards and healthy striving, those are good things. But those are typically, if you genuinely have this from an internal place, it's probably going to sound a lot more encouraging than judging or shaming. So if I make a piece and I go like, oh, I really had hoped that I wouldn't overwork that passage. Or I had just hoped that this would turn out looking more like this particular Sargent painting that inspired it. If I'm coming at this through the lens of perfectionism, I'll start to beat myself up. But if I come at it through that lens of healthy striving, I'm probably going to get curious about why that didn't happen. So I might say, I wonder what it was in my process that I could have done differently, such that I can actually use that to set myself up for success next time. So, maybe I should have actually gone in with that translucent wash earlier in the piece. Maybe it would have been helpful to really iron out my drawing and make sure that everything was looking good before I started to commit to color. So one thing that Brené points out that I also want to mention here is that perfectionism, it really isn't just related to shame. It's where shame is born. It has this really corrosive effect. So again, it's not about taste or standards. It's actually about, this breeding ground for that shame that beats you. So it's really more of a breeding ground for the shame that you can use to start beating yourself up and really stifling your creativity. So if you've been reworking a painting for months because of perfectionism, I'm giving you permission right now to rethink that. You can absolutely have high standards for your work, but if you're stuck, it's better to move on and figure out how to bridge that gap over time rather than spinning your wheels endlessly. It's also a recipe for really overworking that one painting. Another really important mindset shift is to paint like nobody is watching. Okay, this sounds so cheesy, and even when I was putting together my notes for this video, I really debated whether or not I wanted to stick with this framing. But I decided to, one, because I think you'll remember it, and two, because I actually think this is a good way to explain what I'm about to walk you through. Building off of this idea of fearing what others think about your work, it's really easy to get caught up in that. Whether we're talking about what other artists would think, what social media followers would think, or actually especially what friends and family will think. But constantly worrying about judgment, it really stifles your creativity. So next time you paint, imagine that no one will even see the piece. That's why I chose this framing of paint like no one is watching. I'm thinking right now of my student, Julia. She had really high skills across the board. She could get really high realism, but she was really sick of painting that tightly. It was just sucking all the joy out of her practice. What she wanted was the looseness, the freedom, the energy in the brushwork. And she could do it if I gave her something like a master copy. But when it came to her own original pieces, bridging that gap between just being able to reproduce the looseness and actually knowing how to put that looseness into her work was a real challenge. And so I remember very clearly, we were talking about this over holiday break. And she and I wouldn't be talking for a little while. And I told her, I gave her this challenge to make 10 paintings between now and the next time that we spoke. And she's a fast painter. 10 paintings wasn't going to be a big challenge for her. But here's the kicker. I said, I don't want you to show them to me. Now, if you finish and you are just so proud of it and you feel like you have to show me because you had that big of a win, sure. But until that point, I want you to tell yourself that no one is allowed to see this but me. And it ultimately really removed the pressure for her and allowed her to focus on what was exciting her about painting rather than worrying whether it would be good enough by someone else's standards. And you know what? Julia had a fantastic breakthrough after that point, and she came back to me after the holiday break with a bunch of paintings that she hadn't planned on showing me, but each and every one, she had these really great takeaways about how every painting represented some breakthrough in terms of her looseness. All right. Next, we all have that little voice in our head that tells us that our work isn't good enough or that it's not turning out the way that it should. But that inner critic just isn't helpful when you're in the middle of creating. So instead of letting that voice take over, I want you to reframe it. So acknowledge the critic and then remind yourself, this is just part of the process. The critic shows up because we care about our work, but we don't need to listen to it while we're painting. Save the critique for when you're problem solving, not when you're actively creating. And next, something that is really key to building confidence and simply reconnecting with your joy while creating is to intentionally build it into your journey. So when we're always focused on improving, we can easily forget why we started painting in the first place. Whether it's doing a quick color study, just playing with our paint on the canvas, or stepping away from the easel to try something different, like fan art or doodling or sculpting, these kinds of reset activities can often remind us why we do this in the first place and really reignite that spark of fun in our practice. So when you make time to play, ultimately you come back to the work of skill building or improving refreshed and more fearless. What I tell my students is go ahead and figure out what those reset activities are for you right now. And the moment you're starting to feel a little bored or burnt out, or you're just lacking that joy, it's time for us to intentionally make time for play. And then we can get back to improving. Now, my last tip is that confidence doesn't come from a single painting. It comes from showing up consistently. So the more you paint, the more comfortable you're going to become with the process, and the less control fear is going to have over you and your work. So I would encourage you to start small. Even 10 or 15 minutes a day can really build momentum. And over time, you'll notice that confidence actually comes naturally, simply by making painting or drawing a regular part of your routine. So it's not about creating a masterpiece every time. It's about building a habit that keeps you in the flow of creating. Now, before we wrap up, I want to mention one really great resource for artists struggling with perfectionism, and that is Steven Pressfield's book, The War of Art. This tiny little book dives deep into the resistance that we face as artists and how to push through it. So if perfectionism has been stopping you from getting into the studio, you're going to find so much insight and inspiration from this quick little read. All right, so these mindset shifts are a great start. But if you would like to dive deeper into understanding and breaking through perfectionism, I have a video all about this topic that I would encourage you to go ahead and watch next. In it, I'm going to be going even deeper into depth on why perfectionism holds us back and what we can do about it. So I hope you check out that video, and until next time, happy painting.